All right. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We're excited to have you here. We'll be going over the SharePoint Embedded for Azure Developer session. We have 3 speakers here today. We have Steve Puslik, Reed Carlberg, and Yogesh Ratnaparky from our team to go over all things SharePoint Embedded. I'll hand it over to Reed to go over our agenda.
All right. Thanks very much, Calissa. And thanks, everybody, for joining wherever you happen to be. I'm actually in the Denver area of the United States, so it is early evening for me, and I am excited to be here. We're going to do a quick overview and demo of what SharePoint Embedded is. We're going to talk about the core innovation that makes all of this possible. And then Steve is going to come on and do a quick demo of how to get started in 15 minutes or less. Then we have Yogesh, who's going to come in and talk about copilots and agents in SharePoint Embedded. Steve is going to come back for an overview and some demos around security and compliance. And believe me, you don't want to miss this. If you've been asking yourself how to do global audit, how to do e-discovery in your custom apps, this is going to be the session for you. Then we're going to talk about some next steps and, of course, take your questions and offer some answers. Now, as we go, you are welcome to post your questions inside the event page, which we're all monitoring and we'll answer as we go. And, of course, if you have a super tough question, I want you to mention Steve in there because he's going to handle that for you. Okay, Steve? All right, that sounds good. Okay.
Yes, sir. Very good.
All right. Well, with that, I want to talk a little bit about why we're here. And I want to start with this notion that that Azure delivers some really powerful and interesting storage capabilities. Now, you're probably used to these 2 core ideas, structured data and unstructured data. In the world of structured data, you're typically using columns and rows in a SQL server. In the world of unstructured data, you're typically doing binary objects in an Azure blob store. And what I'm introducing today, what we're here to introduce today, is this new type of data called collaborative data and a new storage option for it. SharePoint Embedded is a new storage option that lets you work with files and documents inside an M365 tenant. Now, what do I mean when I say collaborative data? Well, collaborative data has some interesting characteristics to it. I like to think of these as this list that's over here on the left, and I want to talk about just a few of them. First of all, this data is active. It's not typically something which is static and read-only. It's something that people are working with, often using interactive tools like Word, Excel, or PowerPoint to modify it in real time. Now, these can also be multiplayer scenarios where you have people who are collaborating on an artifact in a way that they need to work together, and the system needs to facilitate that. Also, these are often things which need to be processed by an LLM. Maybe they need to be summarized, maybe they need to be somehow work together in with other data, but they need to be Copilot-ready. And finally, I want to talk about this data primarily as private, trusted, and in a compliant store. When you think about this high-value data that your business is probably operating, these are 3 things which often are critical parts of it. So that's collaborative data. And when we think about the apps that you're using these might be things like Word documents or Excel documents. They might be PowerPoint presentations, stream files, PDFs. Of course, they could also be JSON files or JPEGs or really any other file type. These are all files that might qualify as collaborative data depending upon your use case. Now, when I talk about use cases, we've put together this kind of sampling of what our customers have told us they're using SharePoint Embedded for. We've actually been generally available since May, the Build conference, and it's currently in use by companies large and small around the world for all types of line of business and ISV apps. And interestingly to me, governments have a little bit of a reputation as being slow to adopt new technology, but we're actually seeing governments as early adopters of SharePoint Embedded. Now, I want to give you a super quick demo. Actually, before I do that, I want to remind you of these things called the 4 C's. I almost forgot this, and this is my favorite part of the presentation. So the 4 C's are really a core requirement of collaborative data, and these 4 C's are compliance capabilities, collaboration capabilities, Copilot capabilities, and of course, core enterprise storage. SharePoint Embedded makes it fast and easy to deliver these requirements as part of any app, whether you're working with a line of business app or an ISV app. So with that, let's do a quick demo so you can see a high-level overview of what it is that we're talking about. So I'm just going to bring up my browser. And this is just a regular app that I've built running on my local host. I'm going to sign in. And this looks familiar to you. It's a regular Microsoft sign-in. And I'm now giving some permissions to the app. We're going to talk more about these later. And then you can see I have a very basic user experience. Note that this isn't SharePoint user experience, the SharePoint Online user experience. It's one that I've created. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create this thing called a container. A container is this new thing that's part of SharePoint Embedded, and we're going to talk about that. But really, that needs a name and a description. And my clever description is that this is a description. You're welcome. And now, because this is an API-only service, I'm showing you all the API details, including the URL that you call, the body of the request, as well as the results. And don't worry, these are all well documented. We're going to get into some detail on these. For right now, I'm going to go to continue, and I'm going to look at all the containers that I have created. And you can see I've created this SPE for Azure Devs right here, and I created it right now. So I'm going to go into that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and upload a document. Now, I happen to have a few documents that are actually what I'm going to do, because that did not do exactly what I wanted. Sorry. I'm going to go ahead and start with a blank document. And we're going to call this SPE demo. You got to love live demos. And it goes ahead and creates the file for us. We'll click on continue. And again, live demos. Don't worry about that, though. Here we go. So here's the SPE demo that I created. And we're going to go ahead and open it. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to let actually Steve do this because something is wrong with my thing. Actually, here's what it is. Sorry about that. You got to put your thing on the end of it here, and then it creates it just fine. Now, here we are in a blank Word document. This is a regular Word editor in the web. And of course, if you prefer to use Word in desktop, that works too. And we're just going to say, this is a demo. And then we'll go back over here and we'll go to localhost. And we'll list this one more time, just so you can see this in action. Here's my demo too. We'll click on edit. And you'll see it now has all the changes that I put in there. Okay, so that's a super quick demo of what it is that we're showing you, how SharePoint Embedded works. Now with that, I'm going to go back over here to our presentation. And what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the core innovation that makes this whole thing possible. So when you think about SharePoint Online today, you might not know this, but already today, SharePoint Online is a partition system. So if you think about this as kind of a representation of an M365 tenant, you know, across that whole tenant, you have this shared M365 storage platform. Within that platform, you have two partitions typically. You have SharePoint Online and you have OneDrive. And although these have different security capabilities and they have a different set of user interfaces, they are actually operating on the same storage platform. So it's this partitioning capability in SharePoint that we're harnessing, because what SharePoint Embedded gives you the capability to do is actually creating your own partition. So you are creating a dedicated space within the M365 tenant for your app. That's really the core innovation behind what it is that we're talking about today. Now, SharePoint Embedded is an API-only, headless version of SharePoint specifically designed for apps. As I said, it's a dedicated partition inside your M365 tenant. And we're going to be talking a lot about ISVs today. And ISVs are actually working in a dedicated partition inside their customer's tenant. It includes standard M365 collaboration, security, and compliance capabilities. It is fully integrated into content management and control systems in the SharePoint Admin Center. It is Microsoft 365 Copilot-Ready. And it is all metered consumptive APIs on Azure powered by Microsoft Graph API. Finally, it's really important to note that it includes all of the M365 business continuity promises that you're used to. So SharePoint Embedded is a really powerful way to embed Microsoft 365 features in your app via an Azure service. Now, I said before that this is generally available as of May this year, as of the Build conference. And I wanted to just bring this post up because it actually has quite a bit of information in it that you might find helpful, including a great 2-minute video that you can see down here on the lower left-hand side. So if you want to scan that QR code, it'll take you over to it. And that 2-minute video is perfect for forwarding on to any of your users, any of your developers, any of your business decision makers you think might be interested in SharePoint Embedded. Okay, I want to really point out this very important thing that SharePoint Embedded is a special type of product here at Microsoft. It is, in fact, how we are building and delivering many of our newest Microsoft 365 apps. So when you think about Designer or Microsoft Loop or Copilot Pages, all of these are delivered via SharePoint Embedded. So when you are developing a custom application, and again, this could be a line of business application that maybe a system integrator is building for you, or it's a LOB app that your IT department is delivering, or it could be an ISV app that you're buying through a marketplace or directly from a customer. When you do that with these applications, you're actually building on the same trusted, scalable, global system that Microsoft is building many of our new apps on top of. So we have this core problem, though, our customers do, that we have noticed as we start to talk to people about how they manage files and documents and apps. And it's that files and documents are scattered literally everywhere in a typical enterprise. So for example, you might have a finance app which has a bunch of PDFs related to accounts receivable or accounts payable. You might have an HR app that has a bunch of personally identifying information like very sensitive documents about particular workers. You might have a sales app with customer-specific information, or a work management app where people are collaborating on a PowerPoint presentation or Excel document. And the challenge is that when you have these fragmented and siloed systems, you end up with very labor-intensive administration and management. And you also get these security and compliance challenges because all of these systems have a different level of capabilities. And so what our customers are typically looking for is they're looking for this, a unified content platform. And the idea is that every app across your enterprise is storing files and documents in the same trusted, compliant system that includes all the collaboration capability they want, all the content management capability that they want, and of course, all the content AI capabilities that they need as well. Now, when we talk about enterprise AI apps, we actually notice there are 3 big steps. Number 1, get all your data in the same place where a system can reason over it. Number 2, make sure that all of that data is secured via policies, access control lists, and retention periods. And number 3, make sure that you integrate with a common set of tools that your customers are used to using. So this should sound like SharePoint Embedded because this is exactly what SharePoint Embedded is for. Now, when I talk about delivering M365 features via your apps, it is a ton of features that you are able to now surface as part of your application. So we talk about these as the 4 C's. So Copilot, compliance, collaboration, and core storage. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on all of these. Steve is going to take a deep dive into compliance. Yogesh is going to take a deep dive into Copilot. So I'm going to touch a little bit just right now on collaboration. Because when you're working in a system like this, what you want to make sure is that you have the ability to use tools that your customers are used to using. And for many customers, that is Microsoft 365 tools like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And so SharePoint Embedded includes the ability to do one-click editing via the web client or via a desktop client. You have full desktop support across all 3 of these tools. And when I say full desktop support, I mean it includes multiplayer capabilities like co-authoring, live presence, and app mentions. You also get the ability to share with both internal users and external users, and that's actually a configurable setting for your app. So if you absolutely do not want to share with external users, that's something that you can configure. Now, finally, and this is a very popular feature and it's one of my personal favorites, is that you gain the ability with SharePoint Embedded to do automatic preview for popular file types like PDFs and more than 300 more. So if you have an app which is working with everything from DICOM images to JPEGs to PDFs to Word documents, SharePoint Embedded is a way that you can actually work with all of those in a seamless manner so that your customers have a very cohesive experience. Now, I also like to call out Fluid Framework. Fluid Framework is a great multiplayer framework that really helps you build collaboration into any app that you might be working with. And one of the ways that you can power Fluid Framework is just by putting SharePoint Embedded on the back end. If that's something that you're interested in, you should definitely talk to us. And don't worry, we're going to share a bunch of emails around so that you know how to get in touch with us quickly and easily. So I want to come back to this for just a second. So I showed you this graph just a second ago. This is the core partition, or excuse me, the core innovation that really drives this capability. And it's that you can create your own storage partition. Now, within that storage partition, we're introducing a brand new concept called SharePoint Embedded Containers. SharePoint Embedded Containers are a new and very lightweight document management primitive. So the whole idea is that you can instantiate them as part of an app very quickly. It's not a slow process, it's a very fast process, and they're highly scalable. You can have 100,000 of these per tenant per app by default, and if you want more, we can actually increase that limit. 100,000 is kind of the number where we want to start talking to you and make sure that we understand kind of how you're using them. Now, it's important to note that your app has full control over the containers that it owns and manages. When you're thinking about how to build these containers for your app, you want to go back to that notion of the business problem that your app is trying to solve. So for example, when you think about a legal professional services app, those typically use an architecture where a container maps to a legal matter. When you're thinking about a different type of professional services, maybe you're thinking about an advisory service or consulting service, those will typically map to a to a project. So there's lots of different ways for you to map containers, and they're designed to be that type of very flexible scale, unit, and security boundary so that you can use them in whatever way makes the most sense to your app. Now, Steve's going to show this a little bit, how you can do some management of these containers within the SharePoint Admin Center as well, using a role-based access control that we created specifically for SharePoint Embedded. Now, I want to just really land this point that containers are strongly typed. So although you can have lots of different systems using containers within your M365 tenant, by default, each app can only use its own stack of SharePoint embedded containers. So for example, on here, you see that we've got 3 different apps, and each one is using its own stack of containers via the Graph API. Now, that's the default configuration. So if you just follow the instructions, that's how it all works, and you don't need to worry about any type of cross-app access to a set of containers. However, if you're also building something which has maybe a microservices architecture where you have very focused apps which are dealing with a common set of documents, that's something that you can do as well. It's just a different configuration. We actually have lots of documentation on how to do that second configuration as well inside our Learn modules over on Microsoft.com. Now, I said before that if you're an ISV, things are a little bit different. So in an ISV, you typically have an arrangement that looks like this. You have an ISV where they have an M365 tenant. That's where they're doing development, and they are doing the definition that creates these strongly typed containers for their app. And then their customers actually install those apps onto their own tenant. And then those apps, when they're working with those files and documents inside containers, those containers are actually inside that M365 tenant that belongs to the customer. So here you see we just have customer 1, 2, and N. We don't really have an upper bound on how many customers you can have your app installed into. So it's a very flexible system that's designed for high volume ISVs. Now, we've got a couple of permission models that you want to keep in mind. Number one is permissions for the apps. So as I said before, we have this default configuration when a customer installs an app, whether it's an LOB or an ISV app, into their production tenant. The customer has to grant a very specific OAuth permission to that ISV app. And we've also introduced this new permission scope and graph that's called file storage container.selected. The idea is that within that permission, you can use a wide variety of capabilities, everything you would need, so that your app follows that least privileges model that we recommend everyone follow from a security standpoint. Now, you can have both app only and app plus user permissions when a user signs in. So on my little demo that I did before, you saw that I signed in as a user. So that was app plus user delegated permissions. There are many operations where you want the app to be able to do it without having a user as part of the session, and you can do that as well. Now, as I said, it is possible for you to grant cross-app access to a common set of containers. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out the documentation. Now, from a user standpoint, users also have a very special role to play, of course. A container only is accessed by users who have the rights to do it. Now, there's different ways that you can have rights. You might have a role that is in one of these special groups on top of the container. For example, there's reader, writer, manager, and owner permission roles. So you can be assigned as one of those roles, and then you would have access to information inside that container. And you might be assigned as a user, as an entry user yourself, as your own username, or you might be assigned as part of an M365 group. Either way works just fine. Now, once you are actually part of this, you can do everything that you need to within the container. But even if you're not assigned to one of these groups at the top level of the container, you can be assigned to have access to just a folder or a file within a particular container. That's a configuration that you can opt for. This sharing model is actually very flexible. And so you have a whole bunch of app-specific settings, including external sharing, and the ability to either allow or not allow sharing outside of your app. So you have a lot of flexibility. Now, a couple things that I want to end on here before I turn this over to Steve and you actually get to see everything in action and how you get to start up in 15 minutes or less. And the first one I want to talk about is resource allocation, the governor limits. Now, of course, every cloud service has governor limits, and we publish ours for both SharePoint Online and SharePoint Embedded. Now, SharePoint Online has a shared set of resource allocation units to it, and it's based on the total licensed users within the M365 org. Now, of course, Azure developers are used to working in a different way, and SharePoint Embedded is actually handled a different way. It is not based on users. What we did was we took the highest allocation you could have in SharePoint Online, and we doubled that. And we said that is our foundational limit for everybody who is using SharePoint Embedded. So that's like 12,000 resource units per minute. That is a lot of activity on an app. But if this is something where you feel like you need more, that's something that we can also talk with you about, and we can increase that limit very easily. Usually at this point in the presentation, people are starting to wonder what everything costs. And I want to point out that this information is published over here at the aka.ms/SPE-adoption page. And so if you want to see that adoption page, see that cool 2-minute video, read some of the highlights, you can head over there. And we price using 3 meters. It's the amount of storage, it is the number of API transactions, and it's egress. Now, I'm actually very excited to say today that we're lowering our egress price. So it is not 12 cents per gigabyte, it is actually 5 cents per gigabyte. These should look very familiar. If you're used to using Azure Storage, our goal was to create something which would be very comfortable to people familiar with that model. And so you're going to see that this really follows it in a very discrete way. Now, the storage here, when we talk about 0.00667 per gigabyte per day, usually we round that up and we just say 20 cents per gigabyte per day because that's a little bit easier to talk about. But the technical definition is this 0.00667 cents per gigabyte per day. Okay. And I want to just land on this real quick before we turn it over to Steve, and that is, when do you use which document management approach? Because we have great options for you. And if you're a developer or an architect, the answer to which should you use always comes down to, well, it depends, right? So Azure Blob Store is obviously a rock solid cloud object store. It's great for a lot of use cases. People have been using it for a long time. So if you are interested in something which is a cloud object store, and it's fine that it's outside of the M365 security and compliance boundary, Azure Blob Store is a great choice. SharePoint Online is a great choice if you're interested in the standard SPO user experience. So SharePoint Embedded doesn't have a user experience, so if you want to use something which is already there, SharePoint Online delivers that capability. It has integrated security. The files and documents live inside the M365 security and compliance boundary. And collaboration is for licensed users of Microsoft 365. Now, SharePoint Embedded, being something that's particularly for apps, has partition security. So it's not integrated with what's already happening with M365. You don't have to worry that something is being inherited. It's entirely deterministic for what your app decides to set up. Your app also controls the user experience. The containers are very lightweight. They are only focused on files and documents. They are not focused on other capabilities. So SharePoint Online sites and site collections have a lot of different capabilities, which are very powerful, such as lists. But usually for apps, you don't need that. And so SharePoint Embedded does not have it. It has a dedicated resource allocation. Files and documents live inside the M365 security and compliance boundary. And very importantly, collaboration capabilities do not require a separate M365 license. So it's both for licensed and external users who might be unlicensed. And of course, it's separately metered. So it's not part of an M365 entitlement. It's something which is metered separately as part of an Azure service. So the right one of these to use depends obviously on your use case. So this is usually an interesting discussion to have. And so if you'd like to have that discussion, you should reach out or post a comment or a question over here in the event page. And that's enough of me for a while. I'm going to turn you over to Steve. Steve, are you ready to get going?
Yes, sir. I am going to start sharing my screen and get right into it. And you should have me now. Good.
Yep.
Alrighty. So thanks, Ray. Appreciate that. What we're going to do is we're going to literally spend the next 15-ish minutes on getting started with SharePoint Embedded. Unlike Reed, who had 31 slides, I have exactly one slide. So we're going to be demo heavy, getting into specifically how to create that trial container within the SharePoint Admin Center, but also specifically how we're going to do that with the Visual Studio Code plugin. So if you're a pro dev or a configure dev, when I say that, I kind of focus on the Power Platform or some other configuration tools that are out there. But regardless, within Visual Studio Code, that is where we have created the plugin that will allow you to quickly create that trial container and see that in the SharePoint Admin Center, but also do all of the plumbing within the Azure environment that you need to get up and ready and using your application in pretty short order. Okay, so we're going to walk through that initially. We're going to set that up in Visual Studio Code. We're going to create that container type. We're going to create that container. We're going to see how to interact with it through the API, but we're also going to take a little deeper dive into what are the components that are created in Azure, because I know that any admin who is monitoring the tenant is a little bit protective, if you will, of what goes into the tenant, how things are configured, not only from a resource perspective, but also maybe from a cost and an allocation perspective. So we're going to identify exactly what is being created so that you have an idea of where to look to troubleshoot or where some of those attributes are. Okay, so as promised, I am going to jump out of the deck. And the first thing that we're going to do is within our Visual Studio Code environment, this is where we're going to go and search for the SharePoint Embedded plugin. So simply do a search in the extensions marketplace for SharePoint Embedded. Make sure that you get the one published by Microsoft. I believe that's the only one out there. And go ahead and enable that. So once you enable that within Visual Studio Code, you're going to see that SharePoint Embedded icon on the rail on the left-hand side. That will allow you to go in and log into your tenant. So if you haven't logged in, there's going to be a big blue button there that says log into your tenant. When you log into your tenant as the SharePoint admin or the SharePoint embedded admin. So those two role-based access control roles that we have in the Entra ID, those are going to be one that you need to fulfill. Again, the SharePoint admin or the SharePoint administrator. SharePoint embedded administrator, sorry. Once you log into there, you are now going to see the containers that you have created within your environment. So if I do a refresh of that, it's going to go back to the Azure configuration. It's going to list the containers that I have created. So if I expand one of those, you're going to see that I've got this container type that I've created. I can also see what some of the containers are that are in that environment. Okay, so once I create my container type, think of that as our collection that's going to hold the containers. Then I'll be able to create the containers, which are the heart and soul of SharePoint Embedded. That's where we're going to interact with our applications. We're going to store our documents. We're going to put metadata on the documents and things like that. All right. Creating a trial container is as simple as right mouse clicking on the container type's root node, and you'll see that create trial container type. Okay, so I'm going to call this Super Session PM. And it's going to prompt me to create that Azure application registration. So you'll notice that down in the bottom right corner, it's going to create that Entra ID app. It's going to prompt us for authentication here in just a second. Right there it is. What we need to do is we need to open that consent link. So this is where I'm going to grab this window. And with that consent link, I need to log in and give authorization to SharePoint Embedded so that it can create that enterprise application. So these are the permissions that it's going to use within the Graph API. We'll talk about these here in a minute. Once we create the application and configure that in Azure, we're going to go back and revisit what those permissions actually do. Yes, I'm going to accept that. And we're good to go. So now that that has been accepted, I'm going to get rid of that window. And it's going to progress here in just a second. Registering the container type. So it's created that app registration. It's registering that container type within Azure. And now it's successfully created. Okay. So you can see over here on my node that now I have a new container type called Super Session PM. Great. Once I expand that, now I have the ability to create a container. So if I right mouse click on the containers, I'm going to create a container, and this is going to be PM containers. I'm going to hit OK there, creating that container. And then we're going to back into specifically what that looks like on the Azure side. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh that. My containers is going to come up, and now I've got my container. So I have my SharePoint embedded container type is created. I've created my first container that I can give permissions to. Now I have the ability to create that secret that I need to authenticate in and use the API as accordingly. Okay, so the first thing I need to do, the next thing I need to do is from a configuration standpoint. Oops, sorry. I'm going to go into the local tenant registration. Oops, right here. And I can generate that new client secret. The two things that you need to authenticate in so that you can start to use that container is the client ID and the client secret. And we'll show you how to get both of those here in just a second. But if I generate that new client secret, you'll see that the secret has been created for that SharePoint embedded app. Perfect. If I right mouse click again, now I can copy that saved secret. So it's going to save it to the clipboard. I can copy that. You're going to want to store this in a secure spot because as you're developing your application, every time that you want to authenticate in and use that container, you're going to have to provide the client ID and the client secret. And we'll show you where that starts to become relevant here in just a second. But now that we've created that secret, now we can start to interact with it via the API. Okay. The next thing we need to do is create or add a user to the container so that they can get access to it. So for that, we're going to switch over to the API, and I'm going to use Bruno as the graph tool that I use to interact with the API. First thing I want to do is I can create that container. So in addition to creating the container through the Visual Studio Code plugin, I also have the ability to do it through the app or through the endpoint in the Graph API. So you'll notice that here is the endpoint that I want to hit. In the body of that request, I'm simply going to give the display name, that description, and what that container type ID is. Now to find that container type ID, back into Visual Studio Code, if I right mouse click and get the, oops, I think it's right here. Yeah. Can copy the container type ID. So when I created that container type, it's going to give me a GUID that I'm going to use to collect all of the containers or group all the containers together. That's what I need to use within the API to create that container. And we're going to see this over and over and over again. The container type ID or the container ID. That's going to become contextual as we start to create containers, upload documents, assign permissions, and so forth. So now we can execute that, create that container, and we can also assign permissions. So if we wanted to create the container permissions, again, here's the endpoint. And this is down to the container level. Earlier, we created that container type. Again, that is the way to organize all of our containers. But now, as I'm creating individual containers, I can put permissions on those containers. So for instance, if I have an application that keeps track of projects, for each project that I'm going to create, that's going to be a new container. I may have different permissions that go into that container based on the level of access, the sensitivity of the project, and so forth. So that's where I need to specify what is that container ID that I want to grant permission to. Okay, so now I can have reader, owner, writer, or viewer. And if I specify what that role is and who needs to have access to it, simply execute that command, and it's going to assign those permissions to that container automatically. Okay. So we'll get into more of the API here as we go along. But again, just kind of recapping the steps. Create that container type. That's going to give you that container type ID that we're going to use to create our containers. Like Reed indicated, we can have up to 100,000 plus containers, depending on what your application is doing, the security of it. And that's kind of where the art and science of container architecture come into play. Once we have those containers created, that's where we start to add files, folders, and interact with that in our application. Okay. Taking that a little deeper, let's go into the app registration. So remember I mentioned that it created that app registration for us in Azure. And if I sort this on the dates that it was created, you'll see that I've got one that was created today. So here's my SharePoint Embedded app that we just created. And if I go into that app registration, a few key things to keep in mind here, that client ID. So remember I said that in order to authenticate into a container, you're going to need that client ID and you're going to need that secret. So here's the secret that we created. You'll notice that it is masked within Azure, and that's on purpose. So when you create that secret, you're never going to get the value back. That's why I copy that from Visual Studio Code, store it in a safe place, because if you lose that secret, you need to regenerate a new one. That could cause some issues with your application. Make sure that you have that configured properly. The next thing that we really want to focus on are those API permissions. So these are the graph permissions that Reed mentioned that get us into the container. So that file storage container selected. And we're going to use delegated permissions. We'll get into that here in a second when we talk through the audit log. And also application permissions if you want to do that. There's going to be one SharePoint permission that's going to be required. The only time that's required is when you register the container type. That's going to register it with the SharePoint Admin Center, which we'll head to next, and make sure that you have that granted for administrative consent. Okay. That's the plumbing that goes into the app registration. Okay, so again, this will monitor all of the activity going in and out of the application. And when you provide that client ID and the client secret, you're going to get that bearer token in return. That's going to be your ticket to interacting with the containers. All right, one last thing that I want to touch on is the ability to look at what was created in the SharePoint Admin Center. So if I go to the SharePoint Admin Center, you'll notice on the left rail, we see active sites and deleted sites, typical SharePoint activity. But if I go into active containers, and I'm going to refresh this really quick, you'll notice that we now have our trial container that we just created with that one container. So our container type that we created, that one container that we have. And if I look at the membership, we haven't added any owners here, but this is another way, in addition to the graph endpoint that we saw earlier, on how we can add people in and assign them ownership rights or whatever specific rights that you want to that container. So if you're an admin, you're not really comfortable with the API, you want to go in through the SharePoint Admin Center, that is absolutely another way of doing that. Also, at the container level, you've got the ability to put in a sensitivity label. We will absolutely get into the nuts and bolts of how those work and applied here shortly. Okay. All right. So I think that does it for my 15 minutes. Reed, I'm going to hand it back over to you to continue on.
All right. Thanks very much for that. It's always fun to see this get up and running. And I will take it for granted that I always have more slides than you. I love the fact that you had one slide and the rest was demos.
I'm a demo guy at heart. So.
I know. You know, nothing beats a live demo as far as you know, or as far as I know, right? Like every time I ever see a live demo, it's impressive. And sometimes they go wrong like mine did, and sometimes they go right like yours did. And next, we are going to see how Yogesh does. Yogesh, you're going to join us and talk about agents in your applications, right?
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. Good evening and good morning, wherever you are. I hope you all can hear me well as well.
We can, but we can't see your slides yet. If you want to share your screen.
Because I was creating the attention to see the slide. Right, there you go.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. So Reed, Steve, thank you so much for setting such a great context on what is SharePoint Embedded, why you need it, when to use it, and Steve for initiating how to build an application from the scratch. So now I'm going to show how you can enable an agent, a Copilot powered agent within the application that you just built with SharePoint Embedded. So we believe that every app will be an AI app. Just a matter of time, it's already happening. When it comes to enterprise applications, though, it's not just about enabling a ChatGPT-like experience within your applications. It boils to 3 key components to making the application truly AI-centric. Let's take Contoso Audit as an example. This is a SaaS application built on SharePoint Embedded, which enables the audit professionals to serve their clients. Now, if you want to enable an agent within this application, there are 3 key components that you seek. The first one is that the agent needs to scope the chat responses within a specific case or a particular client. And then the responses needs to be security trimmed to the user's permissions. And this includes the citations that come out of the chat responses. And then the third one is that the data stays within the client's compliant boundary, right? So these three features is what makes an enterprise content-centric AI application truly successful. And we see this need across different industry verticals, including legal, audit, finance, and healthcare. There's a common theme here where the application needs to make the AI responses, the AI skills very specific, very relevant, and very contextualized to the user's need. And then also make sure that the user gets responses that are only relevant and accessible. And last but not least, especially within ISV scenarios, that the data stays within the customer's compliant boundaries. So what we believe is the next gen AI applications require a new kind of document management system. So if you think about a typical enterprise app, they have three categories of data. The first one is the structured data, which includes transactions and records. And then there is the unstructured data. This includes logs and images. And then there is a third category, which we believe is underserved, especially in the case of AI. This includes this collaborative unstructured content that Reid mentioned, which are the live interactive documents. They are continuously getting updated in real time. And you want to make sure that when you harness knowledge within these collaborative documents, you have the right data management system. So there are really four key aspects for this kind of DMS. The first one is obviously it needs to be RAG ready, meaning your AI solution needs to retrieval, augment, generate on this particular context so that your responses are contextual and relevant. The second thing is the knowledge is compliant, and this includes not just the files, but also the semantic index associated with the content that needs to be within the customer's tenant. The third one is its application scope. So SharePoint Embedded, we talked earlier, where the application needs a full control, and the similar need resonates with this AI-centric applications too, where the application needs to have a full control over the knowledge. And the fourth and the most important part is that this DMS needs to be permission aware. What we see often is customers or partners build these AI applications on the traditional storages like Blob or Dataverse, and then they need to build the permission layer on top of it. And that is not sustainable when you plan to go and deploy to multiple customers. So that's where SharePoint Embedded comes in. SharePoint Embedded enables the full AI stack for your document-centric application needs. So Reid already mentioned it is built on top of the M365 platform. So you get out of the box all the core enterprise capabilities, including security and compliance and responsible AI. And the data stays within the compliance boundary. So that's given. But where SP shines is it enables this powerful middle layer for your application. It is application scoped. The permissions and security trimming is already part of it, and it is semantically indexed. With the SDK that I will demonstrate shortly, you also get a Copilot-like experience that you can drop within your application UX. So you get a full stack. And this declarative agent, as we may call it, is dynamic. And I'll show that in the demo as well, where you can tailor the agent experience to your application canvas. So you can drop this agent within your line of business application or an ISV application and enable the full power of Copilot within your applications. Now, it's not just your applications. Microsoft applications are also leveraging the power of SharePoint Embedded to enable Copilot experience within applications like Copilot pages, declarative agents, and loop agents. They have very similar needs. They need an application scoped, permission aware, semantically indexed knowledge source, and SharePoint Embedded exactly offers that. And what that does is, as an application developer, you can then focus on offering the right user experience, enabling the skills, and focus on your vertical knowledge to enable a niche experience for your customers and your end users. So I'll show this with a demo of how you can plug this in your application. So let me share my demo screen. So what you're looking at is a React application that I built on SharePoint Embedded. This is Contoso's tax advisory application, which enables tax professionals to serve their enterprise tax customers. SharePoint Embedded enables the flexibility to organize the knowledge by containers and folders, right? So in this case, I have used the container as a way to organize my year-specific documents. So 2024 becomes a container for me where I can curate all the knowledge that's needed for me to serve my customers. On the right, what you will notice is there is a Copilot-like agent, which can help me serve my customers even more efficiently. So first thing you will notice is it looks like the hosting application. So the style and the header, everything is customized to the host application. So that gives an additional flexibility. And it also lets you give the zero prompts or starter prompts to make the conversation easier for the end user. So let me start by asking a simple question around summarizing the employer tax changes. So what this chat control is doing is reasoning over the knowledge within this SharePoint embedded container. And the reason it's doing is because as an application developer, I have scoped the Copilot responses to a specific container. And I have the flexibility to set it to a particular file, folder, or all the containers within these particular applications. That way, you can make your responses really fine-tuned to what the user is seeking at that particular moment. So you will notice that the Copilot behind the scenes has not only summarized the changes, but it has also cited the specific file that it used. Because in case of enterprise AI, the evidence is the key in case of Copilot responses. And this makes this experience really useful and trustworthy for the end users. I can also ask to tabularize this summary with respect to 2023. That way I can quickly summarize the changes that are coming up in this particular year, right? All right, so it did summarize it, but I want it in a different fashion. So let me do this. So summarize employer tax changes in 2024 with respect to 2023 in a tabular form. All right, it's going through similar documents and it's looking for changes and it's telling me there are no significant changes. And again, it's giving me the particular document it used. So that's how you can make your applications even more powerful in the age of AI by using the SharePoint Embedded Agent SDK. The way it works is, and I will show my screen where you will see how easy it is to plug this experience. So once you install the SDK, which comes as part of the sample code that Steve just showed you. So using the Visual Studio extension, you can load the sample app, and the sample app already comes with the SDK. And you have some sample code. So the chat sidebar is one such file which lets you enable or toggle this SDK within your application. So the sidebar, it invokes or implements the SDK. The first step here is to set the auth provider, right? And once you have the auth provider, then you can customize it, including the header, the theme, the zero prompts, and so on. You can also set the meta prompt. You can say to act like a tax professional, and the chat experience will behave like that. And then the last thing, which is the most important one, is to subscribe to the data sources. That way you can dynamically change the scope to a particular file or a set of containers and make the responses super contextualized to what the user is looking at. Now, how does this work? So you're probably aware of how Copilot works. So there are really 3 steps to a Copilot processing. When the user makes a prompt, the first thing the Copilot does is sends it for pre-processing, because the user might be asking for something confidential and you want to ensure that this particular query or prompt is really accessible and appropriate for this user. And then this processed or pre-processed prompt is sent to the LLM, which also does the responsible AI check in addition to actually processing the prompt. And then the third step is, once it has a set of responses, it will do a post-processing. And this is where the magic of graph comes in. The Microsoft Graph is semantically indexed, and Copilot can make sure that this information is not only searched with a natural language processing, but also that it is accessible and permission. It's permission with the right roles and controls. And the reason it works for SharePoint Embedded is because SharePoint Embedded is really yet another partition within the Microsoft tenant. So SharePoint, OneDrive, and now you have SharePoint Embedded. And SharePoint Embedded containers and the files within get the same treatment as the content within SharePoint and OneDrive. So content within your SharePoint Embedded application is already part of the semantic index. The vector embeddings are auto-generated, and you get the full security descriptors. That way you don't have to build your ACLs on top of your AI solutions. And this functionality is available for you today. It's in private preview, and you can get started using the link here, and Reid will recap with the link again so you get a chance to copy this link. Now, as we look into the future, we are here. The green box shows the scope for what you have in private preview, and we are expanding this into a public preview soon. This gives you an access to SharePoint Embedded containers, and you get to set the scope in runtime. And you have a set of SDK files that you can use to quickly build this experience. But as we expand, we envision a world where you will have even more flexibility. So the chat gives a quick way to enable Copilot within your app. But how about programmatic access to Copilot? So we are working with our partners to enable this experience, so you have even more flexibility. And this comes in handy when you want non-chat experiences, or you want to have multiple agent experiences, or you want to enable the same agent with multiple data sources, SharePoint Embedded being one of them. So with the APIs, you will have even more flexibility to enable a full Copilot experience within your application. And all of this will soon be available with consumptive billing, because the current private preview requires the application to have a Copilot license for each of the end users. So we're planning to enable more flexibility on the billing side of things. So that's how our roadmap looks at a high level. We are here in private preview. We plan to go public preview early next year. And then we plan to go GA, where you will have additional functionalities, including the API access and consumptive billing. And as we look into the future, as I mentioned, we plan to offer you additional extensibility with Copilot Studio and even Azure AI Studio. So to recap, I encourage you to explore this functionality. The way I believe AI applications can be successful is by building your experience, showing it to your end users, using the feedback and iterating until you truly feel that you have solved problems for your end users. And for that, we invite you to collaborate with us. So reach out to us. There is the link where you can learn more about this functionality, sign up for the private preview, and there is a contact information where you can reach out and partner with us to further enhance this functionality. So with that, Reed, I hand it over to you, or is it Steve, whoever wants to take this to the next step?
Well, Steve's going to take on the next portion, but I have to say that I was kind of blown away the first time I installed Copilot in a tenant and you got the sidebar up and running. It really is quick and easy to do. I'm curious, as you talk to customers and partners about this, you know, what kind of initial feedback are you getting from them?
Yeah, I think the similar one that you said, they really love how easy it is to enable this. And when customers follow up with their proof of concept or demo that they build and then they show to their customers, they are pretty delighted how easy it was. The next thing they typically ask is really about the security and compliance part of it, right? And they are happy that the Copilot knowledge within SharePoint Embedded has the same benefits that a SharePoint Online has, and that definitely helps. And I think the next one is really the billing, which is why we are investing into enabling a more flexible billing solution for this application. And the API part is another feedback we get from customer too, where advanced application developers want full access to Copilot using APIs. And that's something that you saw is already part of our roadmap.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Yogesh, thanks so much for jumping in and walking us through that. Steve, I think it's your turn to take over from a collaboration and compliance standpoint. You ready to go?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, sir. All righty, so we are going to transition into the collaboration portion of it and also compliance, how your purview investment really extends itself into SharePoint Embedded applications and content. Reed showed a little bit of what the integration experience looked like through his initial demo. We're going to go a little deeper on this one to really better understand from an API perspective, what are the endpoints that we want to call? What are the attributes in that response that we're going to use to populate our application? So we're going to dive deep into that. But what users really expect is that full Office experience. When I open a Word document, I want it to be in a Word environment. There's a lot of third-party plugins. There's a lot of components that you can use to put into your applications to simulate what that experience looks like, but it's not the Office experience. And when we say the true Office experience, the collaboration, and I will tell you, the collaboration and co-authoring is a major engineering feat. The ability to, as you can imagine, if there's 10 people opening a document, keeping track of where each person is, what modifications they're doing, versioning, conflict resolution, all of those things that we have solved within that co-authoring experience is truly amazing. In addition to that, we're going to really walk through what are some of the discovery portions within the purview environment, and also what are some of the preview or the file previews that you can use within the application as well. All right, so I've got a couple demos that I want to walk through specifically regarding the integration capabilities. So I'm going to bail on the deck once again, and I'm going to get back into my environment. So in my environment, what I've done is I put together a Power App. So this truly demonstrates the capability of the front end. We always say that bring your own front end and hook it up to SharePoint Embedded. In this case, again, I've got a Power App that will display the containers that I have created within my environment. And within the respective container, I have documents that I can view. As I'm going and selecting that container, you'll notice that I've got the documents that are in my grid. If I simply click on that document, it's going to open that up in the Office experience. From a developer perspective, we're going to back into specifically what that looks like. But this is the true Office integration. Co-authoring, collaboration, app mentions, comments, you name it. Sensitivity labels, which we'll talk to here in just a second. But you'll notice that any changes that I make, they're all going to be saved back to that container. So it's very container aware and keeping track of the version history as it goes. You'll notice we have full sharing capabilities. If I wanted to open this up in the desktop experience, I can do that. But you'll notice that in the top left corner, if we click on that cloud icon, you'll see that it came from a document library. So if you are thinking that I'm going to be a little sneaky and I'm going to go back and see the contents of the document library, that's something that we have sealed. So again, this is something that is only accessible through the API, and we designed it that way so that it can be secure and you control that user experience again. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at how that is populated. So how easy that is to get the documents from that container and then use that JSON response to populate that grid. So I'm going to go back to Bruno's. I'm back into my API environment. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my token here, make sure I got a good one. And within the endpoint, I'm going to simply go and get all of the items that are in a container. So this portion of the endpoint is pretty much the same. I'm going to focus on a specific container. Okay, so now if I have one container, if I have 10,000 containers, this is where that container management comes into play. But the end of that is really going and getting all the items that are at the root of that container, not within a folder, but in the root. Okay, so if I go ahead and execute that, I'm going to go ahead and execute that. Great. You can see that now I have a folder, and I'm going to know that this is a folder because if I go down to the content type, which is right here, content type of folder, now you can use that to switch the icon, for instance. So that's how I know to put a folder icon there versus a Word document icon versus an Excel document. Okay. So within the JSON response, this is where we need to get pretty fluid in what that structure looks like so that we can go and populate that accordingly. So you'll notice that now I have another folder. But I'm going to go down to a document. So in this case, I've got a document. I've got the claim example -1.docx. Great. Okay. You'll notice this web URL attribute. That is the keys to the kingdom. So if you have this web URL attribute, simply put an anchor tag or hyperlink around that. Whatever is in that link has all the secret sauce that you need to fire that into the Office experience. So nothing that you need to do other than use that web URL attribute in your application. Everything else takes care of itself. Okay. So again, focus on the container that we want to target, what level in the container we want to use. In this case, I'm at the root level. I could also go to the folder level or subfolder level, whatever that looks like. And there's ways of getting at that as well. Okay. Get the document name, get that web URL, And then anything else that you want to display in the grid, simply grab that, populate it accordingly, and you're good to go. Okay. Another thing that you can do is keep track of the version history. So in this case, I've implemented that into my Power App. And you'll notice that for that particular document, here are all the different versions, date and time, as you would suspect. Okay. All right. So from a collaboration perspective, again, open that in the client app, open that in the desktop app, whatever cases, whatever your functionality needs to do, we can certainly help support that. Okay. So that is a little bit about the Office integration experience. We're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about the Purview integration. So taking advantage of that Purview investment that you've made in the governance. We're going to talk first on sensitivity labels. I'm going to go right to left in this case. So sensitivity labels. So this is the ability to secure documents based on the content that you have in it, and also security. So you can place security around these sensitivity labels. SharePoint Embedded will honor that sensitivity label. It'll honor the security parameters that are put around it, anything that you configure in that sensitivity label. As soon as you add that to the container, it's going to add that accordingly. Okay. So one thing to keep in mind is if you have a test tenant that you're using for development, but the document was drafted in a different tenant and has a different sensitivity label on it, when you add that to your test tenant, you may get some access denied issues because it's looking at the sensitivity label, it's trying to figure out where in your test tenant that sensitivity label is. Well, it's not there, it's in your production tenant. So keep that in mind as you're doing some testing. Ask me how I know that. It's something that we run into regularly. Okay, so again, I'm going to jump out of the demo and I'm going to get into specifically what we're going to look at from a sensitivity label perspective. I'm going to navigate over to Purview. And within Purview, if I go to my solutions and information protection, this is where I have the ability to configure my sensitivity labels. I have one already created called highly confidential. I'm going to go into the details and edit that sensitivity label. And we're going to focus on a couple things specifically. So the first thing that we want to focus on is what is going to be defined in scope for this label. What's going to be in scope specifically is sites, SharePoint sites. Because if we think about a SharePoint embedded container, at the root of that container is one site with one library. So that's where it would be included in that scope of being a SharePoint site. So make sure that that is selected. We're going to add some watermarking on there just from a visual perspective so that you can see that there is a difference there. All right, access control. This is the biggie. When we go into the access control portion and we configure those permissions for this label, I've got highly confidential information. I want to make sure that anybody who is an authenticated user can only view that. So if I look at the permissions that have been assigned to that, you'll notice that I have viewer permissions, period. I don't want this stuff to go out of the organization. I don't want people to share it. I don't want people to print it, okay? We go one step further. I also have a header. This is something that is going to be placed on the document. People pull that up, they're going to see this on the document. It's going to be stamped to the document so that they have visual indication that, yeah, hey, I've got some highly confidential stuff here. We should treat that accordingly. Okay. I won't walk through the rest of the configuration. Those are the two things that I really wanted to focus on. But let's see how that works. Again, I'm going to go back to my project governance template. I'm going to open that in the Office experience. And you'll notice that from a sensitivity label, I've got highly confidential selected. Okay, good stuff. Now I'm going to switch users. So I've got another browser window open that has a different user. So this user is just a normal tenant admin, or tenant user, I should say, going into the application, they're navigating to that same container, viewing the same files. But if they open that file, because they're not a creator of the file, now it's still going to open in that Office experience, but it's going to have a very different look, right? It knows that there is a highly confidential sensitivity label on here. You can see that it was placed on the document. That's the watermark that we configured in the label. And you'll notice that I can't do anything with it. I can view it, great. That's about it. I can't do a save as. I can navigate to another app like I normally would, but I'm not able to really do anything. Even if I try and share this document with somebody outside the organization, it'll resolve just fine, but that send button is never going to enable, okay? So you'll see that it's outside the organization. I can't send it. The link can only be accessed by people with permission inside the organization. So that sensitivity label is absolutely working based on the configuration you have in your tenant and the governance that you've applied to your environment. Okay? So again, another way to protect the document through permissions, SharePoint Embedded will absolutely honor that configuration in the container. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to another area of purview for auditing. Now, I'm in the audit log within Purview. A couple of things that we need to be aware of initially is date and time range. Don't overload your query. That'll take a little bit longer. You'll get a lot of results back. So make sure you time bound that. I'm focusing more on the folder, file, or site. So there's that word again, site. Well, how do we get the site that we want to use for SharePoint Embedded to return the audit activities on that container or container type? Back to our API. This time, I'm going to go and get the drive. So the drive is synonymous with the container. So again, that container ID is going to be one of the parameters that goes into my request. Simple get request. So I'm going to execute that. And what I'm focusing on here is this web URL for the container. So you'll notice that it's got my tenant information, content storage. So think of that if you're familiar with managed paths in SharePoint, sites, teams. Now we have that managed path called content storage, CSP_good. That is the container that we're in. So that whole thing makes up our site. So we're going to grab that. I'm going to go back to my audit log and I'm going to do a paste on that. So this is going to scope this audit query down to that particular container and the workload of SharePoint. Okay. Once we have that, we're going to search. It's going to queue that job so that it can go and gather all of the activities that happen for that particular time range, for that particular container, and so forth. One thing we can also do, wildcards. Now I'm going to search the container type. Everything that's in that container type, all of the containers now can be returned. So be careful. If you've got 10,000 containers, you're going to get a few results back, okay? More than 194 than I have here. Once that's completed processing, simply go into that audit results, and you're going to see the results of that 194 items that met the conditions for that search query that I just executed. Okay? I uploaded some files, I did some recycling. Let's see, I modified a folder, probably changed the name. But if I click into that, now we can see specifically what happened. Okay, so here's the client ID. Here's the app it was in. So remember that client ID, client secret. You're going to see that everywhere. Date and time, who did what, where, when, IP address, all that fun stuff. So this is specific to that particular activity that happened in the audit log. Again, this is where delegated permissions matter, because the user is going to be recorded in the audit log because that's the activity that they performed. If we have application level permissions, everything is going to be a single user. So if you're trying to chase down somebody who created this folder, or more importantly, deleted the folder, use delegated permissions. So now you have a short list of people that you can go focus on. Okay. All right. So that is the audit log in a nutshell. Last thing I want to cover in Purview is e-discovery. Once again, if we go to the Solutions tab on the left, we're going to see e-discovery as an option that we can view. I've created a few cases around e-discovery, one specifically around SharePoint Embedded. I won't drain the whole process of creating the case and going through the lit holds and things like that, but one thing that we do want to focus on is what are the data sources that we need to put a hold on so that we can use that within our e-discovery case. Because naturally, if you're starting up an e-discovery case, the people who get wind of the content that you're now searching, they're going to go on a delete spree. Well, we want to prevent that, obviously. So once you've identified that data source, it's going to put that hold status on that data source. So even if they delete it, they're not going to be able to delete it. Or even if they try to delete it, they won't be able to, because now we have placed a hold on that data source for obvious reasons. Okay. So if we want to add a new data source, SharePoint is going to be the location. Edit my SharePoint site. So what goes in there? That URL to the container that I want to index and use within this e-discovery case. So you'll notice that once I put in that URL, add that to the case, now that becomes a indexable data source that I can now use in my review sets. I can use it to export content out because I needed to send it outside counsel, whatever the case is. Again, that hold status is going to be applied to the container. So if you try and delete that container through the API, through the SharePoint Admin Center, it will notice that, hey, there's a hold on this container. You're not deleting it. Okay? Once the case is over, the litigation hold has been lifted. Now the execution of that content happens, meaning if it's older than 93 days, it's going to bypass the recycle bin and just be deleted. If it's within that 93-day period, it's going to go into the recycle bin so that you can do recycle bin activities. If it's active content, it's going to go back to active content. Okay, really no implication to the user there, but works the same way as other data sources that you would configure in e-discovery. Right? Okay, so last thing I want to focus on is some of the billing portions. And when we created a container, we created a trial container. So there's no subscription that's associated with that trial container. When you create that standard container, this is where the meters start to accumulate. And you'll notice that I have a subscription called Puslik Demo. And if I go into the Azure billing portal, specifically for cost analysis on this subscription, okay, so heavy emphasis on this subscription. To answer your burning question, yes, there are going to be support for multiple subscriptions coming, something we are working on now. But if we look at the specific filters, you'll notice that now I have the API transactions. So I'm up to a whopping 87 cents. Storage, I'm almost at a nickel. And then LRS. So this is the egress, getting it back out of SharePoint Embedded. Okay? So you'll notice that you can specify, I've got the meter specified, I've got the meter category, for syntax, which is the category the SharePoint Embedded would fall under for billing, and then also the product itself. Okay, so here's my API transactions. Here is the region that I'm in, and so forth. So you can start to see what the actual usage is, and then what that projected usage might be for the rest of the billing period. So if I keep going, I may be up to $5 here. Okay, but again, a way to keep track of not only the enterprise applications that you're focused on, but any of those applications that you're using with an ISV. So if you have deployed that to a customer tenant and you want to monitor that Azure subscription, you can also do that within the Azure Billings portal. Okay. I think that does it. Let me just recap the slides here really quick, but I believe that that is what I wanted to cover on the integration, purview itself, and then also some of the audit logging. So with that, I will wrap there. I haven't been monitoring the chat. Hopefully, Reed, we've got some good chat questions going on.
Yeah, we've had a lot of good questions actually going on. So I want to thank everybody who's been viewing and talking with us about questions. We have questions about container architecture, how to do things with Copilot. We got things about different JavaScript frameworks and whether or not you can use those with SharePoint Embedded. It really is quite fun to see kind of the different ways that people process information and think about this. So I think with that, I get the honor of bringing us home. So I'm going to round out with a couple of things about how to get started, and then we're going to say good night, good afternoon, good morning to everybody and let them get on with their day or their evening, whatever pursuits they have. But so the first thing that I want to call out is that, you know, this is really a good opportunity for you to tell your developers about SharePoint Embedded. So if you're a business decision maker, or you're somebody who is an architect, or maybe you're a developer and you want to tell your fellow developers, this is a brand new product. It's a brand new option. It is a new way to manage files and documents as part of every Azure app you build. And remember, it delivers the 4 C's. So if you take away one thing, I want you to take away these: that it delivers compliance, collaboration, Copilot, and core storage as part of every app you're working on. Now, of course, you also get isolated resource limits, which is really critical when you're doing app development. You get isolated permissions, so you have really deterministic permission and deterministic access to content that's stored in SharePoint embedded containers. You have integrated administration capability via the SharePoint Admin Center, so you don't have to build that. And of course, you get to use everything. You get to build everything with the Familiar Graph API. Now, we have some questions that people frequently ask, and so I'm just going to go ahead and put these up here. You know, a big one that people commonly ask is, when should I use SharePoint Online and when should I use SharePoint Embedded? You might remember I had that slide kind of walking through, you know, which option might be right for you. A good rule of thumb is that SharePoint Online is great when you need to have the SharePoint Online user experience and the M365 resource limits work for you. SPE is great when you want to build your own user experience, you want partition security, and you want to have a dedicated resource stack for a high-use application. Also, it's great if you want to do collaboration with unlicensed guest users. That's a whole thing that you can do in SPE that's completely unique. Do we support Power Platform and Dynamics integration? You know, you saw Steve walk through his Power Platform app that he's put together. It's a great example of things that you can do with an API-driven offering like SharePoint Embedded. So you can definitely connect with both those platforms. We have more kind of in the roadmap around Power Platform. So watch this space. As soon as we have something that is available for you to try, in addition to the work that Steve's done, we'll be telling you. Now, we also have this common question around whether or not SharePoint Embedded supports the same anti-malware and antivirus scanning that SharePoint Online does. And yes, it definitely does. That's a core part of our value proposition. It's one of the key M365 capabilities that shows through when you choose to use SharePoint Embedded. Can you use guest users with a SharePoint Embedded container? Absolutely. Lots of configuration options. That's a good place to head over to learn.microsoft.com and read about them. And then, you know, how about the first stage and second stage recycle bins that SharePoint Online has? Is that the same with SharePoint Embedded? SharePoint Embedded is actually a bit simplified. It just has that first stage. So it still has the recycle bin, which is great, but it is limited to that first stage right now. Now, I want to call out, we have a bunch of ways to get started, and I'm going to take my favorite one of these, which is this Start-SPE. When you go there, you're going to go to learn.microsoft.com, and it's going to have all the information that you could possibly need about how SharePoint Embedded works. It is a fantastic resource. The team, well beyond everybody that you see here delivering this presentation tonight, we have a rich team that's been putting this together and has been iterating on it, as we start to have more questions from customers and run into more situations. So that is your key resource, that aka.ms/start-SPE. The next one is this customer connection program. This is a wholly unique opportunity here with SharePoint Embedded, and I would encourage you to take a look. We are building a unique community of builders and makers, people who want to get in and write some code and build apps using SharePoint Embedded. And this is a place where you can interact with your peers and learn from things that have worked well for them, things they've had challenges with, discuss container architectures to your heart's content. And of course, we're in there all the time as well. And, actually, Yogesh, if you don't mind, I'd love to have you come off mute and give the pitch for this next one. I think you do it better than anybody.
Yeah, for Copilot or agents, this link will walk you through with every step to build an app within your, build an agent within your application. And it's really fun. Like if you're an application developer, it's just like amazing how you can kind of reason with knowledge and show it to your stakeholders. And we would love to hear feedback from you. That these use cases is what makes this product making really fun, and we look forward to hear from you.
All right. And actually, Steve, you spent more time in the sample code than anybody on the call today, I think. You want to give the pitch for the next one? Talk through, give a reason they should go take a look?
Yeah, so the SPE samples is just that. If you are creating a React application, if you want to use the application that Reed showed, if you want to use the Power App application that I showed, whatever you want to use to get started, we've got samples to get you going. Detailed documentation, blog posts on how to configure that, and more importantly, the documentation to walk through the API. The heart of everything is in the API and how you interact with it. The more you get familiar with that, the more successful you're going to be in your application. So, but don't think you need to start from scratch. We've got you covered.
All right. Well, that about does it for our time today. I want to also thank Clarissa Yee, for kicking us off and getting everything organized on this. This event today would not have happened without you. Thanks, Steve and Yogesh as well, my co-presenters here. This has been fantastic. Thanks, everybody who jumped in, and I look forward to seeing you at the next SharePoint Embedded Super Session. Stay tuned for more information.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you all.